Good evening, everybody. Evan Lazar, Alex Barth, Patriots Beat podcast live Q&A edition. We are going to take as many questions as we can today. As the title of the show tells you, rapid fire. We're going to go through as many players on the roster. That's the goal. So let's set the table here with how we're going to do this, Alex. I think the best way to do it, drop a name in the chat. Not a big picture question, but more just a specific player name. And Alex and I are going to just go right through as many of those guys as we possibly can over the next hour or so. But as people start to trickle in and we get some of these questions rolling, Alex, a big day for you, I would say, with the helmets announcement. I want to clear the floor and let you kind of explain exactly a couple of things. I guess I have questions, so you can answer them, hopefully. The first one is...
So hang on. Well, you ask your questions. I'm just going to get prepared here.
Okay. All right. You get. Oh my God. That's I can't knock that. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So the NFL announcing today that for people that don't know that starting in 2022. The league is going to announce or allow, alternate helmets. And what that means is Alex is sporting right now the Pat Patriot logo, the red and white helmets with the Pat Patriot logo on the side. Those are now going to be allowed again starting in 2022. So not this season, but next season. And I guess my question for you, Alex, was, first of all, when was the last time that the Patriots wore the Pat Patriot helmet? And secondly, just how excited you are to see the Patriots back in the gear that you are wearing right now.
Yeah, how excited am I wonder, right? It's Gerard Mayo, by the way, in case anybody's curious. So they wore it in 2012. The last time they wore it officially would be 1992, 1993, but then it was the throwback, right, that rotated in. And there's three versions of the white Pat Patriot helmet. There's a gray face mask, a red face mask, and a white face mask. But basically, there's been this thing in the NFL since 2013 called the one shell rule. And what that meant was, because people say, oh, how could, the Packers had their throwbacks, the Steelers had kind of a throwback look, right? And how did they do that with the helmets? So the rule was the shell of the helmet, the main part of the helmet, you could only use one all season. You could change the stickers. You could change the face mask. It was supposed to be about player safety. The idea was that players are breaking helmets in, it could be dangerous. And they didn't have a lot of certain kind of helmets. Like Brady wore that old helmet. Remember the VSR4? Michael Bennett had that old school helmet. And there just weren't a ton of those helmets. And they were tough to get their hands on. It was expensive. And then, even the new versions teams got may have been made 10, 15 years ago. They weren't necessarily safe. So they didn't want to have to rotate through those. Now, a couple things have happened. Since then, it's been proven that rotating helmet shells doesn't really do anything for concussion numbers one way or the other. And the NFL has made it illegal to wear some of those older helmets that there's shortages of. So, the helmets players wear now, teams are going to be able to order them, get new ones on a regular basis. So because of that, we kind of heard that this was coming last year. It had been rumored. Now we have it. It's going to allow teams to wear a helmet color where the base is different than their normal helmet. So the Patriots still could, the rule wasn't against throwbacks. The Patriots could have worn, with the one with the flying Elvis on the shoulders. That would have worked because it's still the silver helmet. But the Eagles, Kelly green, the Steelers, yellow helmet, the Bucks, creamsicles, obviously, with the white helmet. Those were different shells than what the team traditionally wore. So if they wanted to switch to those, they would have had to make that their full-time helmet. So that's essentially what the rule was. It doesn't sound like they repealed the rule. They're just making an exception that completely invalidates the rule. But this is where we are. So, and again, the Patriots could have always brought back the red jerseys, but they would have had to do it with silver helmets, and that just wouldn't have felt right. So now they can. We'll see if they bring back the traditional look, maybe try something new. The other thing is I'd like to see before the Pat the Patriot logo, you can look this up. And I didn't know this was coming today, but I published my Patriots uniform rankings this morning on 98.5 thesportshub.com. And there was a helmet the Patriots wore before Pat the Patriot. It was only in their first year. It had a pilgrim hat logo, like a triangle hat logo. It was very cool. So they should try to bring that back too, because that was a great look. So that's my whole helmet spiel and jersey spiel.
So there are a lot of Patriots fans out there when this news came out in my mentions talking about how these helmets, how this whole kind of uniform, or shell as you call it, is cursed, right? Like the whole thing is cursed because the Patriots that used to wear those didn't win any Super Bowls, weren't a very successful franchise, things like that. Looking back on it, though, I always remember Tom Brady going off in games where they wore the red and white uniforms. I think the biggest one was, I believe he wore it in that snow game against the Tennessee Titans, right? They were in those jerseys, I think, where he put up like ridiculous numbers. Even I think he had like 6 touchdowns before halftime or something like that. The Thanksgiving game against Detroit was a big one where they had
Thanksgiving games against Detroit. They wore it.
Yeah, that was the one that's sticking out to me is old long-haired Brady with the with the. I don't remember exactly what year
that was 2010 because it was Devin McCourty's rookie year when he took the kickback. They also the first time they wore them as throwbacks. So the first time they wore them after they got rid of them altogether was on Thanksgiving against Detroit in 2002. And Antoine Smith had a monster game that day. So I get people thinking they're being cursed, but at the same time, they actually had a worse winning percentage than the Flying Elvis ones. And they only wore those for 3 years. But it's, they wore the red ones for so long, it's up and down, right? But I don't, I think it's I don't think it's cursed.
1985 AFC Championship game was, if you want to go old school, I'm sure there are some big games in the 70s with John Hanna and those guys as well, where they were wearing those types of jerseys. So a fun development here today, especially in the middle of the off season. We get to talk about old school unis and get these red and white helmets back is really the biggest thing is the helmets and the league allowing you to wear multiple helmets now. Are the Patriots bringing back the 90s Flying Elvis unis that you're talking about? Because I thought there were some rumors about that, weren't there?
Yeah, well, I mean, they put some smoke out there about it. They started tweeting a bunch of pictures of it. They started selling them in the pro shop. And to me, the perfect time to do it, right? So they only wore those for a 3-year window, 96 to 99, which, they made a Super Bowl before things kind of fell apart. But the most notable win ever in those uniforms came against the Jacksonville Jaguars in the 1996 AFC Championship game. This year is the 25th anniversary of that team, right? The second Patriots team to make a Super Bowl that lost to the Packers. They also happen to be hosting the Jacksonville Jaguars. So it would be kind of perfect to honor that team. And I know, people have this weird thing in this market about honoring teams that didn't win a title in the 67 Red Sox and all that. But if you wanted to honor that team, and that was objectively a very important Patriots team, if that team doesn't go on that run, we might be talking about the St. Louis Stallions or maybe the Hartford Patriots or something. So even though they didn't win the title, that was a very important Patriots team. What better way to honor them? 25th anniversary, the same team they beat to reach the Super Bowl. If they were going to bring them back, this year would be the perfect time. That being said, I haven't heard anything about it. I don't know. I feel like we probably would have heard by now. So we continue to wait.
We continue to wait, but the big news today, the Pat Patriot helmets, the red and whites with the Pat Patriot logo, can make a comeback starting in 2022. So not this coming up season.
Right. You won't see it. You won't see it this year. It's starting next year. But you might see, they might tease it this year. Like, we'll probably know.
We'll probably find out when maybe they'll be wearing them eventually this year. We don't know the schedule yet, so it's kind of hard to tell exactly what game they would bring those back in. But what jersey or just around the league? I know the Bucks creamsicle with the white helmets with the Buck logo on it is a big one. But is there any other team's helmet combination that you're looking forward to seeing, Alex?
Yeah, so I just did a thread before we hopped on of all the best. Of course, you won't retweet it. You won't. Of all the best alternate helmet looks. So I said some of them before. The Steelers yellow helmet is a great look. Yeah. The Eagles Kelly green. I know people like the blue and yellow one. That one sucks. The Eagles Kelly green is a great look. The Dallas Cowboys original white helmet is one that I'm a big fan of. I don't know if the Bills will bring back red helmets. Talk about curse. That would be a good one. The Falcons with the red helmet with the gold trim. The Broncos orange crush. The Colts had those random dark blue helmets they wore. Okay, all right. I'm listing them all off. I'll end it on this.
I like the Dallas white ones. Those
when
ones
did Dallas wear? Oh, Dallas white. I thought you said Denver for some reason.
Yeah. Dallas white, I feel like is nice. I'm not sure what era of Cowboys football that was, but
so that was the first couple of years. It was like 1960, 1964, 5, and then they used to wear them on Thanksgiving.
Okay,
like
so that's
recently.
probably where I've seen them.
Right,
yeah.
Romo wore them. I don't know if they, I don't think they were as like before Romo, but they didn't make it after Romo. The one other one I'd add, this is really interesting. So the Houston Texans have never had a throwback uniform, but when the team was originally introduced, the helmet was the uniform was supposed to have a white helmet. And at some point between the unveiling and them actually taking the field, that changed dark blue. But it might be cool to see them bring out the white helmet finally. I know that's like a thing with Texans fans, the white helmet, but it would be cool to see if they bring that back.
Okay, so yeah, I would love to see the Texans were the Oilers technically, right? Or is that
no? So the Titans were the Oilers. So you want to see the Houston Oilers uniforms?
Yes.
So when the Titans moved to Tennessee, there were actually 2 years where they were the Tennessee Oilers. That was an actual team that existed for 2 years. That was like the Eddie George era with the white helmet and the red face mask. That's a great look, but they should bring it back as the Tennessee Oilers and not as the Houston Oilers playing in Tennessee.
Okay, so that's your jersey talk. I did want to bring up one other thing in the chat real quick. We were texting about this earlier, Alex, but again, drop all your questions in the chat. We're going to get to the questions right after this, but we both saw it. I'm sure a bunch of people saw the new big screen in the far end zone, the closed end zone of the stadium. So not the open end zone horseshoe, the closed end of the stadium. The Patriots have installed a giant, as Alex gets undressed, not all the way undressed, I hope. The Patriots have installed a giant new scoreboard there that is sort of, as you said, retrofitting, right? Where they're trying to get a little bit more modern in the stadium to some of these crazy new stadiums. Like the stadium down in Atlanta has the big ring on the top. That's a video board, or Jerry World has a giant video board down in Dallas. But the Patriots have a giant video board now in that closed end zone. And to me, looking at the pictures, and we'll see it in person soon enough, and maybe it will look a little bit better in person. But seeing the pictures of it now, it looks like they just dropped in something that does not belong there. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like it looks very out of place being there. And we were texting about this earlier. I think it's important to mention it, that potentially the Patriots in the next 5 to 10 years may be starting to talk about a new stadium, right? And maybe getting to that point where they see, okay, Gillette, we've kind of done all of the sort of updates we could think of and little tweaks to make it more modern. But at some point in time, I think that Robert Kraft is going to want one of these monstrosities of a stadium like what we see in Dallas or Atlanta or we're at Minnesota, all these new stadiums around the league.
So I don't know. I don't have the specific number for the NFL, but across the 4 major sports, right? Here's why building a stadium is very tricky. The average stadium becomes outdated after 20 years. Okay. On average, it takes 30 years to pay off a stadium. So building a stadium, you're basically committing based on the averages to having an outdated stadium for 10 years or losing your investment. There's a couple other things that factor in here that aren't in the Patriots' favor. One, Kraft privately finance a stadium entirely, which rules,
right?
Because it's kind of dumb the taxpayers have to pay for stadiums the way they do. And shout out to Robert Kraft for that, but it makes it more of an investment. Also, the era where Gillette Stadium was built was right before you saw the technological advances in stadiums take off, right?
It was terrible timing.
Like it really was the last stadium built before this kind of era of mega stadiums with, Jerry's World, Mercedes in Atlanta, the Lucas Oil, right? You're seeing all these megas, even like San Francisco. It doesn't just have to be indoor ones. So Gillette Stadium's in a weird place where it's not as old as some of these other stadiums that need to go, but it also predates the modern technological era. So, and yeah, you see it with the scoreboard here. They've been adding things, and they've done a good job adding things over the last 10 to 15 years, but you're just not going to be able to fit everything, all the modern technology you want to fit. Right now, it just looks weird, but at a certain point, forget how it looks, you're going to run out of room. So it wouldn't surprise me. So that's all just speculation. I do know that at some point soon, the state is going to want to redo that part of Route 1. So it would make sense, because what they'll probably end up doing is moving Gillette to the other side of the highway and then expanding Pat's Place. If when they redo Route 1, you time that up with the stadium and you move the stadium across the street where the parking is now. So this is just kind of a guess, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start hearing rumblings about potentially a new stadium in the next 5 to 10 years.
Neither would I. And as the owner of the Patriots and Robert Kraft being someone that is so held in such high regard across the league, right? Somebody that is considered one of the top, like, 5 most influential owners, let's call it, maybe. I would say that that's going to be something that he's going to want to do, is really blow it out of the park with the new stadium. And we're going to talk, guys, it's the middle of June. We have a long time to talk about the team coming up here in a second. So let's get to some of these questions, Alex, and we can start right at the top. We wanted to do individual players, so I'm going to try to pull up as many of those as we possibly can. And let's start with this one here from Will on Jalen Mills. I think Jalen Mills is a really interesting player for the Patriots because, to me, he's best as a safety, maybe a Patrick Chung type of replacement. They had to play him at outside corner a whole lot in minicamp because Stephon Gilmore isn't there. So he is potentially a jack of all trades. I think that that's probably his best usage, but they might be stuck playing him at an outside corner depending on how the Gilmore situation shakes out. So I'm really curious to see what the team thinks of Jalen Mills and where they envisioned his role being. I would assume it would be to lean into the versatility, but maybe they are stuck with playing him more at outside cornerback than what they originally envisioned.
Yeah, I think that the best use of him is as a safety, whether it's box or deep. I think we saw him as an outside corner in Philly. There's a reason he changed positions, but at the same time, I think this is why they were drawn to him over some of the other safeties on the market. He's going to give them an ability to play outside corner. He's going to give them an ability to play in the slot and kind of enhance their depth elsewhere. So it's going to be weird to see where he ends up, how they end up using him. And I don't think the picture is totally done. Like I've said, I think they add an outside corner at some spot, and that's going to massively benefit Mills because it's going to allow him to play a higher percentage of his snaps at the safety position.
When I looked at the Mills signing, I at first I was kind of scratching my head because the Eagles, he really struggled for most of his Eagles career. But then when you kind of get into it a little bit more and you see his tape and you recognize the position switch and all these types of things, it seems to me like they kind of felt like they had maybe a little bit of a younger Jason McCourty, somebody that could wear a lot of different hats, that could play a lot of different positions, play inside, play outside, play a little bit on the back end, but have a little bit more experience as a pure safety and obviously be a little bit younger than Jason McCourty was. So I thought last year the Patriots wanted Jason McCourty to take more reps at safety, deep safety, kind of in that Deron Harmon role. And he did do that, but he wasn't a natural safety back there. You know, he's been playing corner for 10, 12 years or something like that since he got into the NFL. And Jalen Mills at least has a little bit more experience on the back end. He's younger. I think he has that potential to sort of be that, we're just going to put you where we need you that week. If we want to play too deep, we're going to put you back. If we want to play cover one man all game long, maybe you'll cover the tight end. Maybe you'll play in the box like as a money backer like Adrian Phillips did last year a lot, or something along those lines. So I think they saw a more versatile player in Jalen Mills, a younger player in Jalen Mills, but his snap percentage, I think, is going to resemble a lot of what Jason McCourty did for the Pats the last couple of years. Let's move on to one of the best rookies, I thought, other than Mac Jones, probably the best rookie player at minicamp. I think I would say maybe even better than Mac Jones at times. Christian Barmore was really, really good in minicamp. Now, granted, there's no pads. We do all these caveats every time we bring up minicamp. But right. What's the role and what do you kind of envision seeing for Barmore this season? Because I think a lot of us sort of pegged him for that early career Adam Butler role where he's playing maybe 25-30% of the snaps as a passing down situational type of interior rusher. But the way that I saw it at minicamp, and if that progresses into training camp, I think he's going to be one of the most talented D linemen that they have. And if he can mentally handle all of it, I'm not saying he can't, but it's just for every rookie, if he can mentally handle a bigger role, I think he's going to be tough to keep off the field.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot to be excited about. And, you know, I bring this up all the time to the point where people get annoyed with me. They don't like to play rookies. They like experience. But the thing with Christian Barmore is he's just such a perfect fit for a role that they need to fill in Adam Butler's old role. And I don't think that's where he spends his whole career. But as a rookie, I just think he's the best fit on the roster for that role. It's an important role, and he can grow it, during the year, over the next couple of years where he's just going to be on the field more and more. I'm really, really excited about Christian Barmore. I think Patriots fans should be excited about Christian Barmore.
Yeah, he's someone that I feel like is going to almost demand a bigger role, right? And you look at some of these other guys on the roster, I don't think any one of those guys has sort of the athletic upside and explosive upside that Christian Barmore has. So I'm really fascinated to see how much he ends up actually being able to play, because he's someone that I think can play a whole lot early on, just because of some of the things that they get out of him that they don't really necessarily get out of other players. You put Henry Anderson's a nice veteran player, but is he going to give you sort of the splash play ability or the tackles for loss and sack production that a guy like Christian Barmore can? Certainly not. So I think that's going to be a really fascinating situation there. We talked a lot about Stephon Gilmore last week, Alex, but I guess, or on Tuesday, excuse me. But if you have any updated thoughts on Gilmore, there's a bunch of Gilmore questions here in the chat. I think we're both pretty much the same as we were, but any updated thoughts or evolving takes on the Stephon Gilmore situation?
Yeah, nothing new. He just, they need him back. They're a completely different team with him. They're not a contender without him. They got to figure out a way to get him back.
So let's answer the question then. So paying Gilmore or trading him away, which one do you think is the better?
I mean, unless you're going to trade him for like a young corner who can step in right away and partner with J.C. Jackson, right? If, the Saints, this would never happen. If the Saints want to get out from Marshawn Lattimore's contract, right? And he's got, I think, 2 years left. Gilmore has 1. You essentially do what the Celtics did with Kemba Walker and Al Horford. That would be the only scenario where I would trade Gilmore. I don't, it's not realistic. It's not going to happen. You need him on the team. Pay him.
All right. I agree with you as well. I would pay him. I would pay him. We would pay him. I don't know if the Patriots will end up paying him, but I do think there's a better chance that they pay him than not. And I think that might surprise some people. But the way that Bill Belichick has built team this year, the way that he seems to want to continue to build this team, I think that they are moving in a little bit of a different direction where they do recognize, okay, we're not going to have an MVP caliber Hall of Fame GOAT quarterback. Right. We're not necessarily, right. Mac might be good, but we're not necessarily going to have that. So we are going to have to make sure the rest of the roster is in good shape. And I think that getting rid of a guy as talented as Gilmore is something that's sort of moving in the opposite direction. All right. Here's the chat's talking a lot about Josh Uche versus Chase Winovich. So I guess we can weigh on this one. Who do you want to keep and who do you ditch? If you have to. Obviously, you don't have to. But if you had to, who are you picking out of these two guys?
This is weird. I don't know that one impacts the other in terms of the roster. I mean, maybe. I guess I could see how you would get there, but they play somewhat different roles. I mean, Uche's been the better player through the spring. So, he's the hot hand right now. I'd stick with him. But, is there another player I can cut? I'd like to keep both of these guys. I think both of these guys have upside. I think both of these guys play an important role. Is there like maybe a veteran who maybe slightly better right now, but doesn't quite have the ceiling, doesn't quite have the contract control that these guys do? It shouldn't be one or the other with these guys. If you're a Patriots fan, you should want the team to keep both of them. They're both good players.
Yeah, I definitely see Uche as someone that plays a little bit more of an off the line of scrimmage type of role than Chase Winovich, but I am fascinated to see, because we didn't see Winovich at minicamp. We saw him a little bit at OTAs. It didn't look necessarily that different in terms of size. Mike Reese had that report that he was going to gain a couple, maybe 10 pounds or so to try to bulk up a little bit more to set the edge. I'm interested to see if Winovich evolves or adapts to the Patriots' way of things, or if he continues to play the way that he's sort of played his entire football career, I'm sure, even probably going back to high school. And that is just as a guy that's aggressive, wants to fly off the ball, wants to get into the backfield, wants to make those big plays behind the line of scrimmage, wants to rush the passer, or is he going to buy into being this sturdy edge setting presence in the mold of more of like a Rob Ninkovich type, right? Or can he kind of get into that happy medium of Kyle Van Noy, who sort of his last year with the Patriots was able to pressure the quarterback, but also be a stout edge setter against the run and sort of toe that line of aggressive versus not aggressive. And I think that those types of things are difficult for players to feel out, and you have to sort of have the right dose of both. And I think Van Noy deserves a lot of credit for that 2019 season of being able to find that line of it's okay to be aggressive here, it's not okay to be aggressive there, and being able to toe that line. And that's, I think, what Winovich is going to have to do if he wants to stick here long term beyond his rookie contract and so on and so forth. I don't think that there's a major rush for the team as much as there is maybe conversations amongst the media and the fans to trade Chase Winovich. I think that that's a popular take to have right now, but I don't think that that's necessarily something that the team is pressing to do at this point in time. Now, if he comes into training camp and he's getting outplayed by Uche and Jennings and Ronnie Perkins and all these players ahead of that just kind of came in, not necessarily ahead of him, but just kind of came in, then maybe that could change. But right now, I think the conversations about trading Chase Winovich are way more from people like us and from the fans on Twitter than what's actually being discussed in the walls of Gillette Stadium. So at that one, I think we need to calm down just a little bit about talking about that, because I do think the Patriots still think that Chase Winovich is a very, very good player who's an ascending player and somebody that they do like a whole lot. So I wouldn't say that anybody's jumping at the bit to trade Chase Winovich right now. Here's another good 53-man roster sort of question. We talked about this a lot as well, Alex. Dalton Keene versus Jakob Johnson. Now, I've been watching a little bit of Damian Harris tape the last couple of days just to do something on him and the running back situation. And you got to admit, and going back even to the season before when he was healthy, Jakob Johnson's in the mix a lot of the time on those runs, right? Like, he's the lead blocker on quite a few of Damian Harris's big runs. We know that the Patriots used to like, or have historically liked, that fullback in the backfield, the 21 personnel, but we've talked a whole lot about how they're going to kind of go to more 12 and 2 tight end type of sets. But does Jakob Johnson's lead blocking ability, because that's really all he does, is he's a lead blocker. He's a battering ram. Does his lead blocking ability outweigh Dalton Keene's potential and Dalton Keene's versatility?
Yeah, so I had both of them off the roster on my roster projection, which you can check out at 985thesportshub.com. I think that with the 2 tight end sets, you're not going to see a ton of fullbacks, because now you're getting into 22 with the fullback, and then you just have 1 wide receiver, and that's a pretty transparent formation. I think in the cases where they do need a fullback, if it's a Dalton Keene kind of fullback, Jonnu Smith can do that. And if not, we've seen Brandon Bolden play some fullback for this team. We've also seen them use linemen, whether it's Dan Klecko, Richard Seymour, Russ Hochstein. Right. They used a linebacker, right? Landon Roberts. I don't think they're entirely if they could keep Johnson, I think they'd love to. If they could keep Keene, I think they'd love to. But where it's going to be such a crunch, and they have other ways to fill that role of both the lead blocking fullback and the receiving fullback, that I think both these guys right now, because of the change in offense philosophy, are on the outside looking in.
If they don't feel like they can get that out of one of the tight ends, whether it's Henry or Jonnu or Devin Asiasi as sort of that fullback on the goal line or short yardage, when they want to go into that package, you do wonder if they pull a guy from a different position, right? Or if they look at, we've seen them do defensive players, as you mentioned, we've seen them use offensive linemen. I don't know, maybe Justin Herron can come in as a 6th offensive lineman and be a fullback, so to speak, on 4th and 1 from the half-yard line, right? The Patriots have used those types of things many a times before. So if they don't have a true fullback on the roster, I have a tough time putting Jakob Johnson on the team too. I think he's really good at what he does, but he doesn't do enough things for the team to justify keeping him over some of these other guys that can do multiple things, play in multiple phases, line up in multiple spots on their side of the football, have some youth and potential recent draft picks. Are you going to keep Jakob Johnson over Anthony Jennings, or are you going to keep Jakob Johnson over some of these other younger players that you've drafted in recent years? It just seems like keeping a fullback that can do one thing well, and that's lead block, over somebody that maybe has some potential to do some play a larger role for you down the road is a tough pill to swallow.
And the interesting thing about Johnson in particular, because he's a part of that international pathway program, they can put him on the practice squad without using up a practice squad spot, and he becomes fully protected. They can't use him. Now, he can't play in 2021 if that's how they designate him. But if he's not going to make the team, and like we've talked about, they have these other options at fullback, maybe that's a way you're just like, look, there's not a role for him this year, but we like him as a player. You can hold on to him, not use up the practice squad spot. You don't have to worry about anybody taking him. And then you get to reevaluate next year. And if, you really missed him, then you put him back on the roster next year. So I think too, that international pathway element is going to make it in some ways a little harder for him to make the team, because they don't have to keep him, but at the same time, they know they won't lose him.
It's a good point, and maybe next year or down the road at some point in time, they do end up going back to more of that 21 personnel type of stuff. And this year they feel like, okay, we know we're going to have the 2 tight ends on the field a vast majority of the time. So we're probably not going to go full 22 personnel and only have 1 wide receiver out there, right? So maybe this isn't the year for Jakob Johnson, but maybe next year will be the year. And I guess we can see how things shake out in training camp and preseason. If there's injuries, if there's any issues like that going on, also could maybe dictate some of this. Let's talk about Isaiah Zuber. I think Isaiah Zuber is one of the more fun players to discuss on this team going into training camp.
It's one of the more fun players to watch.
He is a fast, speedy guy, and that is something that they don't necessarily have outside of a guy like Isaiah Zuber and Nelson Aguilar. So what's Zuber's potential? And also, what are his odds of making the 53? I feel like there's a very, very good chance that all of our training camp notebooks, all of our preseason takeaways have a lot more highlights next to Isaiah Zuber's name than N'Keal Harry's name. And that's going to be a really gut check type of decision by Bill Belichick of, do you trade or do you cut the first round pick in favor of a guy like Zuber?
So with Isaiah Zuber, right, I have him on right now. And a lot's going to change between now and when the decisions have to be made, but I have him on right now. And I think the difference is when you look at that back end of the wide receiver depth chart, right? Because you're talking about the 4th or 5th wide receiver. Aguilar, Bourne, and Myers are going to get 70, 75% of your wide receiver snaps total. So you're talking about, 10, 12 plays a game. And then where does Gunner factor in? Because Gunner is going to make the team if he plays more as a wide receiver. Now you're talking about maybe 5 or 6 snaps a game for this guy, right? Does N'Keal Harry either have a chance to move into that top group, or is there a way to maximize those minimal snaps he's going to get versus a guy like Isaiah Zuber, who you can scheme around? You can come up with plays for Isaiah Zuber. I don't know that you can do that to the same extent with N'Keal Harry, at least not on all parts of the field, maybe in the red zone. But we saw last year with Isaiah Zuber, their ability to use him on end arounds, gadget plays, things like that. He's also a great kick returner. He was an All-American in college. And we didn't see him return a ton of kicks last year, but that's something that they're thinking about, right, in terms of how they're going to use him. So he gives you that gadget playability, which you don't necessarily have elsewhere. Maybe a little bit with Nelson Aguilar, but not. So here's the thing about Isaiah Zuber. You mentioned his speed.
I don't think you want Nelson Aguilar doing that, right?
That too, yeah.
Right.
But with with Isaiah Zuber, he's not just fast, he's quick. He can move laterally. He can move in small spaces. He can get around people. So he's going to give you that, that gadget play ability. He's going to give you special teams ability. I don't know that you have either of those things with N'Keal Harry. So when it comes to that last wide receiver spot in a guy who's probably not going to contribute much offensively in the traditional sense, you look at versatility, and it's Isaiah Zuber. Now, I'm not saying the spot's his, to be granted. It's not just N'Keal Harry he's dealing with. Devin Ross had a really strong camp last year and might have made the team if he had some preseason games. Christian Wilkerson is a guy that some people on the beat, I wasn't at camp last year, so I didn't see
he's got a fan club.
He's got a fun, look, Doug Kyde's a big Christian Wilkerson guy. I trust Doug Kyde. Doug knows what he's talking about. So not that, you don't or I don't, but, if Doug sees something, I'm going to look a little closer. So, it's going to be a close run there at the end, but I think Isaiah Zuber has a unique skill set that the Patriots are really going to like.
We'll see what happens when there's a lot of more contact on these routes, but the speed, definitely, you felt it in minicamp. Like, the corners had a tough time keeping up with Isaiah Zuber in minicamp at times. He got a big deep post route from Brian Hoyer where he just kind of split the defense and ran right through everybody. I think he's got real NFL speed. And you mentioned the gadget play stuff, and I think that's such a key element to the offense that I want to see Josh McDaniels incorporate more and more. They did it a lot in 2018 with Brady, but the run game advantages that you have from motioning players before the snap, whether it's Cam or Mac Jones under center, it really doesn't matter. Just the way that it affects the defense, because it's eye candy, right? You run that player across, everybody on the defense thinks that the ball's going with that player, right? And nowadays there's so much ghost motion and fake motion that you run that player across or on an end around or something like that, and it's almost always going to pull somebody out of their gap. And that's exactly what you want to do. You just want to have that influence on the defense to move everybody over, to shift everybody over, or one guy has to go with that player and it moves a player out of a gap or something like that. The other thing is, and look, he's not Devontae Smith, he's not Jalen Waddle, but Mac Jones, a big part of that offense at Alabama was throwing to those motion receivers, right? They would motion the receiver around. Sarkisian loves a boomerang motion where he comes in motion and then he bounces back out to the same side that he was coming from. Things like that were a huge part of Alabama's offense, and Mac Jones was able to make really quick decisions on RPO schemes to be able to decide, okay, we got the numbers on the outside, we don't have the numbers, we have the advantage in the inside, whatever, and handing the ball off versus throwing it out to that player. You can count a lot of huge plays that Bama had last year off of those motions behind the backfield by their wide receivers, putting Waddle in motion, putting Devontae Smith in motion, and having Mac Jones just dump it off to those guys and have them run with it. And the one thing that Sarkisian always says about the motions that I really, really like is he said that throwing to receivers on the move is way more effective than throwing to stagnant receivers, because when you get guys on the move, they've already built up the speed, right? So when Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith are already going from 0 to 60 and they're already at top gear by the time the ball is in their hands, they're way more dangerous than if you just throw them like a little button hook and expect them to turn upfield and run with it, right? So if you can get those receivers moving, and I think Zuber is certainly not as fast as those two guys, but he's got some really good speed. And if you can get him moving on some of those plays, have Mac flip it out to him, then you can really start to get some big plays out of it. And then, as you mentioned, the special teams value too, having a true kick returner, right? Last year, that was a little bit of an issue. I think it's kind of been an issue since Cordell Patterson left, right? They haven't really had a guy back there on kick returns that was a huge impact. Right, Gunner had a great season on punt returns, but not so much on kick returns. They haven't really had a big impact return man on kickoffs. So maybe you throw Zuber back there. Maybe he can do some of that too. I think he was an All-American kick returner in college, wasn't he? So
Zuber, yeah. I've only said that like every show for the last 5 shows, but yeah.
There we go. So I had him off my initial 53 or my most recent 53-man roster projection, but I can easily talk myself into changing that, and I almost want to change it at this point because it feels like he brings a whole lot to the team that they don't necessarily have unless you want Nelson Aguilar running jet motion and stuff like that, which I think there might be better usages of Nelson Aguilar within the bigger picture of the scheme. Want to talk kickers? Should we talk kickers?
Let's do it. We're already kind of on special teams.
Yeah, so Quinn Nordin versus Nick Folk.
So real quick, shout out to Bob Sosi. I found Nordin the Machine.
Nordin the Machine. Does Nordin the Machine have a chance to unseat Nick Folk? Because Nick Folk was absolute nails for the Patriots last year. And it's kind of hard to – I think Nordin is a great practice squad guy this year. Continue to allow him to develop consistency and accuracy. And maybe he's the longer-term solution. But I don't know. I have a tough time saying that Nick Folk isn't going to be the kicker for the Pats.
Yeah, it's tough because kickers are so hard to find. And if they really believe Nordin's the guy, even if he might not be better than Folk this year, if they believe he's the guy long-term, you still probably make that switch. That being said, I like what Nordin has, and Bob Sosi did a write-up on him, and it kind of explains what his issues were in college. It makes sense to think he can improve. He was a 74% kicker in college. That's not good enough for the NFL, but he's got a long way to go. This might be a thing where we may not see him. They may not use him in preseason games. He may not kick a ton at open training camp practices, and they're going to do everything they can to get him on the practice squad because I think his upside is tremendous, but there's work to do. if it really comes down to it and they feel like he is the guy and they know it's now or never, I could see them making the switch. But I think they'd like to get him on the practice squad for a year and really work on his game before. So I'm still leaning Folk. I think Folk's relatively safe. You know, is he a lock? I wouldn't quite go that far. But, you know, I think they'd like to get Nordin another year.
I agree with everything that you just said.
If they really were set on finding the next guy, they would have drafted Evan McPherson.
Yeah, I just sort of feel like Nick Folk. Bill Belichick talked about how good Nick Folk was last year, multiple times.
Career year last year, he was excellent.
Huge year, and Belichick always talks about with kickers, you don't want to have to think about it, right? You don't want to worry about it. You don't want the kicker to be the thing that keeps you up at night the night before a game, or when it comes down to it and you're down by less than a field goal and you have to decide whether or not to kick the ball or keep the offense on the field. You always just want an automatic kick. Right? Like you don't want to hesitate. Right. You don't want to have any doubts. And I feel like Nick Folk definitely presents that to the Patriots, certainly based off of last year and just significantly more than what Quinn Nordin would at this point.
Right. So here's the other interesting thing about Nordin. The Patriots have seemingly always preferred accuracy to power when it comes to kickers. And it goes to what you just said, right? They want a guy who's automatic from 40 in more so than a guy who's maybe, you know, you got to think about it 80% from 50 in, right? They want that guy that they know he's going to hit the kicks that they ask him to hit. That's Nick Folk. Doesn't have the biggest leg, although he's surprised with his range last year at times. He hit some kicks that I didn't expect him to hit. I don't know that a lot of people expected him to hit, but you know, Nordin's the big leg that it's going to be a bit of a wild card whenever you ask him to kick, no matter the range. So they've always preferred that accurate kicker who maybe can't go as far out. If they switch to Nordin, that's a full-on change in philosophy at the position, which is not something you see often from the Patriots.
Yeah, I agree.
Then again, the last time they had a massive philosophy change at a position, they'd always had left-footed punters, and then they brought in Jake Bailey. So
he's an all-pro. You never know. Quinn Nordin, he's got a boot. Right? He's got a huge leg. That's for sure. All right, let's talk running backs. I mentioned I was doing some film.
How much is this killing you right now? We talked about uniforms at the beginning, and then we just did kickers, and now we're doing running backs. Are you going to be okay?
It must be June 24th, right? like it must be June 24th. Let's talk about the Sony Michel situation. So I looked this up earlier today because I wanted to write about Damien Harris, who I think is the best running back. But I shouldn't say best running back, best ball carrier on the roster, right? Best early down back, best ball carrier on the roster. Now, looking back at it, the Patriots have always had some semblance of a timeshare at the running back position. So the guy that got the highest percentage of carries in a single season under Bill Belichick was all the way back in 2004. Corey Dillon had 65% of the carries. I think it was. I have the spreadsheet around here somewhere, but 65% of the carries in 2004. That means that 45% of the carries still went to somebody, or 35, excuse me, still went to somebody else.
So what's the highest besides him? Because Dillon is far and away the best running back they've had.
So Dillon was at 65%. Antoine Smith in 2001, I think, was at 62 or 63%. And LeGarrette Blount was at 62% in 2016. So those three guys were the only guys over 60. I looked up some other guys that were up there were like Sony, obviously, in 2019, Ben Jarvis Green Ellis in 2010. Lawrence Maroney in 2007 were some of the other big numbers that were on that list. But it was Corey Dillon, Antoine Smith, LeGarrette Blount were the three guys over 60%. And again, that means that somebody else was carrying the football 35 to 40% of the time, even with a running back as good as Corey Dillon on the roster. So even though I think Damien Harris is better than Sony Michel in a vacuum, it still feels like the Patriots, unless they believe so much in Ramondre Stevenson, and that's really kind of the wild card here, is what ends up how much can Stevenson contribute as a rookie? Somebody else is going to be in that backfield. It's not going to just be Damien Harris getting every single carry. Somebody else is going to have some opportunity there, whether it's a guy like Sony or a guy like Ramondre Stevenson. So which one, I guess, is the question is really, is it's Sony versus Ramondre Stevenson at this point?
Yeah, I still just don't know. Again, you talk about the snap counts with the rookie running backs outside of first-round picks, right? James White had 14 touches as a rookie You know, they just, you know, I think the most for non-first round pick is Stephen Ridley, had 99, but that was, I mean, there were a run of injuries that year. That wasn't planned. So
yeah, Ridley was another one that was up on that made the chart. You know, he was
right.
I think it was 2012, Stephen Ridley's big carry
Yeah.
season.
So it's, you know, I still don't totally know with Stevenson until I see it. I'm going to have to be convinced because everything about the Patriots history tells us that he's not going to play. Their history under Belichick tells us he's not going to play a ton this year.
Yeah, especially given the fact, look, first round running backs other than Ridley, who is really the only exception, first round running backs are the only guys that usually play as rookies. Everybody that's drafted after that for the Patriots usually sits. And I just feel like the Patriots are always going to have two guys that they trust in that early down back role. And as much as maybe Sony Michel could end up being expendable in some capacity if Ramondre Stevenson is ready to take on some sort of a role, it definitely feels to me like Sony Michel is going to be on this team. Yeah,
I think they'd have to get, unless they sign somebody, right? We've talked about this. You know, there's free agents out there I still like, Duke Johnson. Todd Gurley, if you want to kick the tires there, I don't think would be the worst idea if this is the route you want to go. Then Sony Michel maybe becomes expendable. But yeah, as it stands right now, I just don't see it.
All right, let's talk about Devin Ross. So we talked about Zuber. Devin Ross is sort of the other guy that I think is an interesting name on that wide receiver depth chart. You also mentioned Christian Wilkerson. There's some love for him as well. But Devin Ross really impressed me last year in training camp. He had a really good week of practice during minicamp that had the Patriots sign him to the 90-man roster. I think people are going to watch this guy in preseason games. Obviously, the first time that we've seen him in preseason games with the Patriots in August, and be impressed by what they see. Somebody that can play a little bit on the inside, a little bit on the outside, really smooth route runner. I think he knows how to change speeds and uses sort of burst and agility to get open. I think he does create some separation. He's an interesting player, and I think if the Patriots end up cutting him and he has a big preseason, like I would think he might, especially if he's playing in the third and fourth quarter of some of these preseason games, going up against some backup corners, I think some team's going to claim him, honestly, if they do cut him outright and go that direction. Now, I don't know if there's a spot for him. I think Zuber is definitely more versatile, definitely faster, brings that special teams value on kick returns that Devin Ross doesn't. But Devin Ross is going to be a player that I would say is going to be one of those kind of summer standouts, right? A training camp standout.
Right. So Devin Ross is a guy who, to me, is in competition in some ways with Gunnar Olszewski, and not necessarily for a spot on the roster, right? Gunnar's going to make the roster, but you know, Gunnar's role right now offensively is kind of that second slot receiver to lessen the load on Jacoby Myers or Bourne or whoever they use there, whoever doesn't get kicked outside. So if Gunnar shows enough that he can do that role and, you know, they don't really need a plan C there, then it's going to be very hard for Devin Ross to make the roster and they go to a guy like Isaiah Zuber. Now, if Gunnar struggles in camp and maybe they look at it and say, okay, he's really only going to be able to return punts, we need another secondary slot receiver, then to me that opens the door. I mean, maybe Isaiah Zuber gets on that way too, but he's a bit more Devin Ross at this point is a bit more polished. So that to me is Devin Ross's path to the roster. Is if Gunnar doesn't take the strides we're expecting him to take and they're not comfortable, you know, with their slot receiver position, Devin Ross, the one thing you know about him, he's very refined. He's very technique driven. He maybe doesn't have that explosiveness, but he's not going to make a ton of mistakes. They like guys like that. So that to me is how he gets on the roster.
Yeah, I can't really think. I was trying to think while you're talking of like a comparison to another Patriot player because no one's seen Devin Ross. That's the thing, right? Like, you know, no fans have been able to go to training camp since he's been in a Patriot uniform. There's no preseason games with him in a Patriot uniform. So he's somebody that's completely hidden right now from the general public. I can't think of a great comparison, but I'll think about that one. Maybe we'll
Stidham last year, maybe a little bit.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of a wide receiver that he plays like, so that people can understand like kind of his playing style. But this other wide receiver too, Trey Nixon, I think is someone that really didn't do anything of note in minicamp. And sometimes I think we get caught up in players that flash in terms of catches and things like that we can kind of sink our teeth into and say, hey, you know, this is what this player did today. he had one catch, I believe, on Wednesday, the last day of minicamp, but a very quiet minicamp for the most part for Trey Nixon, which is totally understandable for a receiver in the Patriot offense, a rookie that was drafted in the 7th round, not exactly lighting the world on fire in minicamp is pretty explainable. Right. But
right.
Are you still on the Trey Nixon train? I mean, Ernie Adams did draft him, right? So he had to have something that Ernie liked.
So I look at Trey Nixon, how I look at Quinn Nordin, kind of what I explained before. I think he's a guy that with a year of work has a chance to be a really, really valuable player and a really, really good player. I just, do you want to put him on the roster this year just to round him out? And how much can he really contribute as a rookie? That becomes the question. I think he's, potentially a Foxborough flu guy. If they end up using their protected practice squad spots this year, which they didn't use last year, maybe that's where he fits in. I think he can make the team. If they want, another speedster, because Nelson Aguilar is going to be the true number one. If they want, a Damiere Byrd replacement, a guy who's just going to run down the field and force the defense to leave a safety back, then I think Nixon's probably the best guy on the roster right now for that role. It's just with such a roster crunch, is there room for that guy? I still really like the pick. I still think Nixon's going to be a good player in the NFL. I just think he's got some work to do, and I don't know if they have room on the roster right now for a guy who needs that kind of work. But if they get him to the practice squad, I think that's fantastic, because I'll tell you this, if he gets on the practice squad and he sits there, I'm going to come back next year, banging the table for Trey Nixon to be a major part of the Patriots offense.
Yeah, so another popular cut out of that running back group is Brandon Bolden, and I don't know. The Patriots went down this road once before. A couple years ago, they cut Brandon Bolden. The Miami Dolphins ended up claiming him on waivers, or maybe no, he doesn't go through waivers because he's a vested veteran. So I think they ended up just signing him, right? They ended up giving him a contract and signing him, and he didn't re-sign with the Patriots because everybody assumes they're going to cut Brandon Bolden. They're going to place somebody on injured reserve after the 53 cut down so they can bring him back in the season if they want, and then they're going to re-sign Brandon Bolden. That's always the assumption, but they've tried that once before and lost Brandon Bolden. So I don't know. I feel like the Patriots really value what Brandon Bolden brings, and this kind of goes back to Rhamondre Stevenson a little bit as well, is Stevenson has special teams experience at Oklahoma. He's got some pass catching experience at Oklahoma. He's a similar body type to Brandon Bolden. So maybe he's eventually takes on some of Bolden's responsibilities to knock Bolden off the roster in 2022. Are the Patriots ready to move on from Brandon Bolden in 2021 is the question.
No, because of, what we kind of talked about before. I think they're going to value him as a running back this year. With the injury history that Sony Michel has had, that Damian Harris has had, and those guys are good players, but, if those two guys go down, do you want your top two backs, early down backs, James White, we're counting as a pass catching back here. Do you want your top two backs to be Rhamondre Stevenson and J.J. Taylor? I don't know that they'd be comfortable with that. I don't know that I think that's the best route to go. I'm not saying you're going to give Brandon Bolden the ball 200 times this year, but I think there's going to be times where having him as a running option is valuable. The guy who's replacing him on special teams isn't necessarily doing that, right? You're giving his role to Cody Davis. Okay, you're not lining Cody Davis up in the backfield and handing him the ball. So, as weird as it sounds, Brandon Bolden, who is, outside of Matthew Slater, the special teams ace for the Patriots, I have him on the roster because of what he can do as a running back, not as a coverage player. So that's where I'm at with Brandon Bolden.
You also have to remember that Rex Burkhead was a giant contributor on special teams as well. His
not just special teams, offense too. Bolden could be the Rex Burkhead replacement. I think that there's a chance that happens.
Yeah,
he gets that old.
I don't know if he'll play as much on offense as Burkhead did, but the Patriots often talk about how replacing guys on special teams is about body types, right? Like having a guy that is about the same size, roughly, about the same speed, and filling that guy into that role. And you lose two running back body types in Bolden, assuming you cut Bolden, and then Rex Burkhead, who's obviously in Houston, then you're really replacing a lot of that out of this backfield group. Now, maybe Rhamondre Stevenson factors in there a little bit. Maybe Damian Harris or Sony Michel can learn some special teams things. But those guys, especially Damian Harris and Sony Michel, you want them to be fresh and ready to play on offense, right? You don't want them out there covering kicks, 4 or 5 different special teams units and then burning them out for offense. So I think it's really interesting to see sort of how they replace guys on special teams. You mentioned Cody Davis. Maybe he can fill the shoes of one of those guys, but you still, if you cut Bolden, then you're losing Bolden's snaps on special teams that you sort of project, and you already have lost Rex Burkhead's special team snaps from last year. So there's a lot to replace there in the kicking game with two guys that have a lot of experience in the NFL and in the kicking game, and you're probably going to have to turn that over to younger players, and maybe the Patriots aren't ready quite yet to do that is sort of my take on it. We haven't talked a whole lot about Matt Judon because I feel like there's what's there to say about Matt Judon.
Good player.
Good football player. They paid him a crap ton of money. He's obviously going to be on the team. But I am excited to see him, how exactly they're going to use him on defense. Now, you're obviously going to use him on the edge, but Baltimore did a lot of different things with their edge defenders, and I think that was what sort of attracted the Patriots to Matt Judon. Is he rushed the passer. He rushed the passer within the framework of the scheme, right? Stunts, blitzes, amoeba fronts, things like that. He dropped into coverage some when they wanted to do replacement pressures, where they bring pressure up the middle, they drop the edges off. They did a whole lot of that in Baltimore too. So I asked him about this. He said, look, it's a different playbook, it's a different system. But if he was going to be honest about it, I really think that this is a pretty easy transition for Matt Judon into the Patriots defense, because Baltimore is a little bit different in how they do things and get to things, but for the most part, they're doing a lot of the same types of techniques, a lot of the same types of mental things in terms of what players are looking for, what is expected of them. So I'm really looking forward to seeing Matt Judon. I think him, Van Noy, Hightower, obviously the young guys, Uche, Winovich, that's going to be a mean group.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it. When's the last time the Patriots really had a dominant pass rush? Like the pass rush was the focal point of the defense more than the secondary. It's been
right. Like really the 2018, 2019 team did, but that was scheme driven.
But I would also say that, like, I think there's a real chance this year that the pass rush is the focal point, not the secondary. Because even if you want to go back to like 2014, and that team was great, but they had Devin McCourty, Darrelle Revis, Brandon Browner, Malcolm Butler. I mean, that team was stacked in the secondary. Like, I don't know the last time. You probably have to go back to the Hank Poteet, Earthwind Moreland teams. Yeah. Right. And I'm trying to remember who was up front then. That would have been like what, Mark Anderson?
Yeah,
early Rob Ninkovich.
Right.
Yeah. So I think has the chance to be a Patriots pass rush like we haven't seen. I'm really excited about this.
So in 18-19, especially towards the end of the year in 18, and then the playoffs when Brian Flores really started, the amoeba fronts, the zero blitzing, all that kind of stuff. All of it was predicated on the fact that we had the best cornerback in the world in Stephon Gilmore. You had a lot of veteran players back there in the secondary that could cover in cover one, right? Or cover with only one deep safety, or cover with no deep safeties, right? And a lot of the pressure that they got on the quarterback, and they were towards the top of the league in 18 and 19 in terms of quarterback pressure and percentage of snaps with pressure, was scheme-driven, blitzing, right? And different types of blitzing, different types of simulated pressure, things like that. I'm wondering if this group has the talent with Judon, with Hightower, with Van Noy, with Barmore, with Uche and Winnow to get heat with four, right? And be able to actually get to the quarterback, because the Patriots have not necessarily been a team, because they don't typically pay pass rush talent that much, because they always say, oh, we're going to prioritize coverage over pass rush for the most part. I am really excited and interested to see if they're able to generate pass rush without all the exotic stuff, right? Like just four rushers, maybe some stunting and some picking, but not the cover zeros, not the amoeba fronts, not all this other stuff in 18 and 19 that they were doing. Can they just get home with four? And can they be able to do that consistently? Because that would really allow them to do a whole lot of cool stuff on the back end. And I think that just, I can't really think of a Patriot team that had, I mean, I don't know. Those early Patriot dynasty teams were so freaking good on defense that
they were just good everywhere.
Right. They were, Seymour, McGinnis, Vrabel, those guys. But then on
the back end, Ty Law, Lawyer Malloy, Rodney Harrison, Otis Smith, Terrell Buckley. I'll give you a very specific, not odd, but like a very extremely specific prediction for this defense. You talked about the guys that they're going to have and be able to get pressure, with less numbers, right? Get pressure with 4 or 5.
Right.
One guy I would throw into that conversation is Kyle Duggar.
Yeah.
And we saw it rarely last year, but there were a couple times. You remember in the Seahawks game, and I don't think he got the sack. He blew up the lineman, and Winovich got around and got the sack. But Kyle Duggar showed last year he knows how to get to the quarterback.
Yeah,
and I don't think I don't think they're going to use him that way a ton, but I think you're going to see like 2, maybe 3 times a game. It's going to be like their go-to play, right? Their play where they're trying to put the game away or they need a momentum swing or whatever, that they're going to not send the house, but they're going to send Duggar, maybe with only 3 or 4 other guys, but they're going to send Duggar. And I think that's going to be something we track all year and we talk about all year is where did they use the Duggar blitzes? So that's, when we talk about the pass rush, I kind of want to include Kyle Duggar in that. I don't think he's going to blitz a ton, but I think he's going to blitz at important times, and I think he's going to be effective. So that's just another element to this to be excited for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just really think what's fun to me about it is that they can blitz, but they don't have to blitz. And I feel like at times in the past, in order to generate any sort of pressure on the quarterback, because they didn't just have pure one-on-one winners up front, they had to blitz. And that obviously takes a player out of coverage. It sacrifices things on the back end, and good quarterbacks like, for instance, Deshaun Watson or, some of the quarterbacks towards down the stretch in 2019 that started to finally figure out some of those different things that they were throwing at QBs. They really got burned by it, right? By having to commit too many guys to the rush. So hopefully the Patriots, I can't really think of a Patriot team other than those early dynasty teams, which are just, stacked on all 3 levels, as you said, that were able to generate pressure without some sort of help from Bill.
Yeah,
that's what I'm going to call it, right? Help from Bill.
Maybe those teams like in between the 2 dynasties, kind of like I said, the Earth Wind Moreland teams.
Right.
Trying to think who the other defensive backs were in that period. Like the pre-Talib teams, the era between Asante Samuel and Aqib Talib. But the thing is, those teams didn't have the secondary that this team does. So.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. Do you want to do a Ime Udoka moment here, or a Boston sports moment here before we sign off?
Yeah, we need to. Ime Udoka.
Ime Udoka. There we go.
Yeah. I don't know what the hell you said.
Listen, I'm not good with names. You throw one like that at me, it's
that reminds me,
terrible.
I see it in the comments all the time, and I think people have wanted me to point it out. Who is the top wide receiver the Patriots signed in free agency?
Nelson Aguilar.
You're putting a U in there.
I like the U. I think it sounds
okay,
better.
But that's not how you say his name.
I'm just kidding.
Okay, Evan Laser.
Because I've had so many people tell me different pronunciations for Nelson Aguilar's name. Like, I've heard Aguilar, I've heard Aguilar, I've heard, like, everybody has a different, like, everyone gets on me for a different reason. Right. So I'm just going to start calling him Nelson, or Nelly, as they were calling him out there at practice and minicamp, because I give up trying to be right about this.
I'll just say Aguilar is how he says it.
Aguilar.
Aguilar.
Aguilar. All right.
Yeah, no U. I don't know where the U was coming from. But
talk to people.
I'm just trying to help you out. I know I'm kind of being an a-hole about it, but I'm really trying to help you out. Ime Udoka, definitely good hire. I think, it sounds like they gave Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart a tremendous amount of say in the hire. And that's your core, right? Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown are your stars. Marcus Smart's a powerful voice in the locker room. He's your longest tenured player. At the end of the day, those guys being happy means a ton. And if that means they get to pick the coach, I think that's totally worth it. That's not to say, they just picked Udoka out of nowhere. He's a Popovich disciple, which I love. I think, when you talk about coaching trees, and I went through the Popovich coaching tree on 98.5thesportshub.com. It's kind of a mixed bag, but, I like that he's been in that environment. He's won a title. I like that he's a former player. He's been an assistant for years. Everybody was all hot and bothered about Chauncey Billups. I never really got that one because he'd only been an assistant coach for 1 year compared to some of these other guys who had more experience on a bench. Udoka is one of those guys. I think he started as an assistant, I want to say in like 2011, 12, somewhere around there. So, he's been around for a while. San Antonio, Philly, Brooklyn now obviously is where he's coming from. So good hire, defensive minded coach, all of that. So far, I'm excited. They haven't given me any reason to throw my hands up and say, oh, this offseason blows. We'll see what happens going forward, but good addition.
Yeah, I like the coaching hire too, because the Celtics going
also,
into
shout out Jay Williams, the Celtics hiring their first black coach.
Oh yeah, good tweet, Jay. And you got hacked, right? You got hacked. We
all
believe you, Jay. I like Udoka too because when the Celtics went into this coaching hiring process, like some of the big criteria I thought were getting a former player. I thought that was really big because I think those types of coaches tend to relate a little bit more to the players of nowadays because they can sort of be a little bit more lax and they understand, where the players want that leniency and stuff like that. That was really important. Obviously, appeasing the Jays was maybe number one, right? And making sure you keep Jalen and Jason happy. But also I really like about him is what you mentioned was that Popovich coaching tree sort of angle because he was with the Duncan Spurs, I believe, as a player. And I think he might have even coached like the Kawhi Duncan Spurs that won the title later on in Duncan's career. And he has experience in terms of coaching and winning championships. It's not quite the same because, Steve Kerr played with Michael Jordan and won, bunch of titles with MJ, but those types of coaches like a Steve Kerr that has had that type of experience as a player and has some experience. I don't know if Kerr had any experience as a coach. He might have just been as a GM, but regardless, I don't know. I just like those types of hires. I think those guys understand it. I think they understand the sort of ins and outs of the NBA, the types of players nowadays and the way that these players operate. Look, if you want players that aren't the NBA is a different breed nowadays. We talk about this a lot, Alex, right? Like the competitive streak in the NBA, the nasty, kind of 80s vibes, even 90s, right. If that's the type of sports that you want, like just don't watch the NBA. Like that's just not what the sport is anymore, unfortunately, for better or worse. Right? It's just not what the sport is anymore. So it's really important to understand today's players and understand sort of the dichotomy that goes on with these players. And in a lot of ways, you got to let them coach themselves or almost make them think they're coaching themselves. Right? Like,
right.
You got to have to pull one of those like Inception things where they sort of think that they're coaching themselves, but they're not actually coaching themselves. So I really like this hire as well.
I would say at the same time, though, with everything you just said, people seem to point out that Udoka's a very competitive guy and a very fiery guy when he needs to be. So, if there is a way to be competitive in the modern NBA, maybe he's a guy who can figure it out. Yeah,
that's a good point, too. Are the Red Sox going to figure out how to pitch again? Or is this a spider attack?
Everybody else, it seems like, most of them have kind of found their footing. Erod, I thought, the numbers weren't great, but I thought he looked good in his last start. It's just Garrett Richards. He sucks. He's beyond fixing. He needed the spider tack. He's been bitching and moaning about it. I mean, he's not hiding it particularly well what his issues are. I think whether it's Tanner Houck coming back or, Chris Sale coming off the DL, and I don't know that I want to wait that long to get Garrett Richards out of the rotation, but or the trade deadline, they'll figure something out. I think once you get Richards out, the rotation's fine. I'd like to see them add somebody at the deadline one way or the other, but it's really just him. I'm not too worried about where any of the other pitchers are at right now, believe it or not. I think that, their struggles are kind of on par with the league-wide struggles. It's just Richards who's been exceptionally bad.
Yeah, he was terrible the other night. I was watching some of that game, and you could just tell. Like I was just kind of watching his body language and like what he was doing with his hands, and like he's constantly like wiping his hands on his pants and like trying to get it. But you can tell that he needs the sticky stuff. Like you can just tell that he has no grip on the ball. I think Eckersley said something like he's thrown like 3 curveballs, which is like his go-to pitch. He's thrown like 3 of them since they
and the spin rate was like the spin rate tanked. It's brutal. Right. He sucks.
Yeah, he sucks and blows, as they would say. On
I'm not a big he sucks guy, but Garrett Richards might suck.
All right, I think that about does it. We have no Bruins information really evolving Bruins takes or Bruins stuff. So we'll get to some Bruins stuff when some things happen. Thanks for appeasing us, letting us talk about something other than football here for the last couple of minutes. But Alex and I will be back on the show on Tuesday night to do another one of these sort of open-ended Q&As. You guys kind of set the agenda. That's how we're sort of going to get through the offseason, the dead period of the offseason. Obviously, like we did tonight, will lead with whatever the topic of the day is, or the story of the day is, or the news of the day. But we want you guys to sort of dictate what it is that we are going to talk about, seeing that there isn't a whole lot to talk about right now. So you guys tell us. We'll be back on Tuesday night to do this all over again. Thank you so much for watching, and hit subscribe on the Patriots Press Pass YouTube channel, and continue to tune into these Q&As. We have other videos on the channel as well. So make sure you mash that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you Tuesday.